In Schoology, I have provided a factor sheet that gives you step-by-step what to do on factoring. So you might want to print that out, and as we work through this, you can follow along on that factor sheet. On the factor sheet, the first thing you do is you look for a greatest common factor. And so to solve this, I set y equal to 0, and these do have a greatest common factor of 6 and x, so I'm going to factor that out. When you factor it out, that means you're dividing each of those by 6x because you're multiplying it on the outside. So this will be 3x and then minus 4. And you'll set each factor equal to 0. I'm going to do it on the first one, but then after that, I'm just going to do it in my head. So I would set the factor 6x equal to 0, and I'm going to set the factor 3x minus 4 equal to 0. So for this first one, divide both sides by 6 and x equals 0. That's one solution. And on this one, you're going to move the 4 to the other side, and then you're going to divide by 3. And so your other solution is 4/3. So you have two solutions. You have 0 and 4/3. And you could plug those in and check it if you want to. On the second one, when you have a coefficient in front, you're always going to move this to the other side. So it'll be the opposite for that. And then you'll divide by that coefficient. So a fast way to do this problem is just to take the opposite of this number and divide it by the coefficient. So you'll have positive 4 divided by 3, which is what we got when we set this equation up. But you can skip that work if you remember that little trick, opposite of this divided by the leading coefficient. On the second one, they don't have a greatest common factor, so then look and see how many terms you have. And then under terms on that factor sheet, the first thing you try is difference of two squares. And this is a difference, it's a subtraction, and these are both squares. So I set y equal to 0 to solve this. And on the difference of squares, you just take the square root of each of those. And one is going to be plus, and one is going to be minus. And those directions are on that factor sheet. You can set each factor equal to 0, but probably can just look at that. And so negative 2 would make that first factor 0, and positive 2 would make the second factor 0. On example 3, I set y equal to 0, and I'm always going to look for a greatest common factor first, and they do. I can factor out a 2. And then I'm left with 25x squared minus 1. This has a squared term in it, where the others, those were linear factors, these were linear factors. When you don't have a linear factor, you need to see if you can go further. Inside my parentheses, I have two terms. And then on that factor sheet under two terms, the first thing you try is a difference of two squares. That is a square. That is a difference. And this is a square. 1 times 1 is also 1. So I'm going to go ahead and continue factoring this. Take the square root of each of those. One of them is plus, and then one of them is minus. 2 is not multiplied with an x, so that's not going to do anything for the solutions. That is not part of the solution. So to find where they cross the x-axis or our solutions, I'm going to go ahead and set each factor equal to 0. So I'm going to take the opposite of that, so negative 1 divided by 5, that's one solution. And then on the other one, I'm going to have positive 1 divided by 5. You have to take the opposite. And those are my two solutions. Up here, I'm using some words here. Zeros, x-intercepts, roots, and solutions, those are all equivalent questions. So they could ask it in any of those ways, and they're asking you to find the same thing. For example 4, set y equal to 0. First thing I look at is how many terms I have after my greatest common factor, and there are 3 terms. You can look and see if it's a perfect square trinomial, and in this case it is. That is a square root of that is x, that is a square root of that is 5, and if I multiply those together and double it, so 5x times 2, that gives me the middle term, which is 10x. And if you look at your factor sheet, this can be either a plus or minus the double of the first and last when you take the square roots. So this one now is going to be x and 5. And since this is plus here, it's plus, and that's squared. That is a perfect square trinomial. So you take the square root of that, and then if you multiply those together and double it, that gives you your middle term. It is a perfect square. So then square root of that goes in the box, or in the first spot in your factor, and then square root of that goes in the second one, and then you put whatever sign is here in the middle. If you wanted to, you could have also looked at this, that it multiplied to 25 and adds to 10, so that would be 5 and 5. This is the same thing as writing x plus 5, x plus 5. So you can write it either way. For the solutions then, -5 makes this 0. -5 makes that 0. So there's one solution. It appears twice. That's called a double root, but you only have to list it once for now. On example 5, they do not have a greatest common factor. These have a 6 in common, however, that first one does not have a 6 in it. Then look and see how many terms. There are 3 terms. I like to test perfect square trinomial first. Square root of that is x. Square root of 36 is 6. And if I take that product, that's 6x, and I double it, I do get the middle term. It is a perfect square. And so set y equal to 0, and you'll have x and 6. This will be squared. And the middle term is a minus on this one, because there's a minus on that middle term here. If you want, you could write this as x minus 6, x minus 6. Another way to solve this, you could have looked at it multiplies to 36 and adds to -12. So that would have been -6 and -6. So it would be x minus 6, x minus 6. What makes each of those parentheses 0, those factors 0, is x equals 6. It appears twice, so it is called a double root, and we'll talk about more what that means in a later lesson. On number 6, there's nothing they have in common. There are 3 terms. If I square root that, I get x. But that's not a perfect square. So since that's not a square here, this is not a perfect square trinomial. It does have 3 terms. The leading coefficient is 1. So I'm looking for something that multiplies to -12 and adds to 1. So if you can think of the numbers right off the bat, you're good to go. If not, go ahead and just start writing everything that multiplies to 12. So you'd have 1 and 12, 2 and 6. And I'm just going in order. Start with 1 and 2, 3 and 4. 5 does not go into 12, and I've already got 6 and higher listed. So those are my numbers that multiply to 12. It needs to multiply to -12. So one of them has to be negative, and since it adds to a positive, we want more positive than negative, so I would make the smaller numbers negative. And there's my pair that adds to 1. You probably can think of that and skip all of this work, so if you can think of the pair, just write it down and you're good to go. So this will be y is 0 here. We're solving this. And I have x minus 3, x plus 4. And what makes each of these factors 0? 3 makes the first factor 0, and negative 4 makes the second factor 0. Number 7. First step you should always look at is see if they have a greatest common factor. And they do. I can factor that 3 out. Set y equal to 0. And now, look, this has a 1 in front of it, so it's much easier. There are 3 terms inside here. So what I try for 3 terms is perfect square trinomial first. That's a square, but negative 8 is not a square. So I'm going to move on. Leading coefficient is 1. So I want something that multiplies to negative 8 and adds to negative 2. And that will be 2 and negative 4. The 3 is still in the problem, and you'll have x plus 2, x minus 4. What makes the first factor 0 is x equals negative 2, and the second factor is 0 if x is 4. The 3 doesn't have a variable by it, so that's not going to have a factor solution that you have to look for. On the next one, number 8, does not have a greatest common factor. This is a square, but 6 is not. So I'm going to set y equal to 0. There are 3 terms. I already tried to see if that's a square, and it wasn't, so I'm going to move on. The leading coefficient is 1, so that's nice. It's going to need to multiply to 6 and add to negative 5. And the numbers that do that are negative 2 and negative 3. So this will factor to x minus 2, x minus 3. Set each factor equal to 0, so x is 2 and x is 3. And that completes our notes for today.